So I'm going to turn it over to Alexis Bonnell. As I mentioned, she's the Chief Information Officer and Director of the Digital Capabilities Directorate for Air Force Research Laboratory, and is the primary scientific research, which is the primary scientific research development, of course, for the Department of the Air Force, which includes both the Air Force and the Space Force. So, Alexis, I'm hoping that you're ready to go.
I am. Can you hear me okay?
We have you loud and clear. Thank you.
Awesome. Well, it is so nice to meet everyone and to be here. It's my first time getting to meet this group and interact with some of the amazing minds in the area. So it's so nice to be here. For those of you who maybe don't know what it is that that I do, or that particularly the DCD does, I will go ahead and do a couple slides that hopefully Emma is kind enough to advance for me. By way of background, I was lucky enough or unlucky enough to be in kind of 10 of the most recent kind of war zones and emergency situations over the last 30 years. Was also founded one of the federal research labs, and then spent my most recent time at Google. And now I'm very excited to be at the Air Force Research Lab, of course, serving both Air Force and Space Force, which is even more exciting. My role is a little unique in the sense that I actually wear two hats. And what that means is I am both the CIO of all of AFRL, which means that I report to General Kane in that capacity, and really am looking at the strategic direction for technology, and knowledge and information at AFRL. But I also am the director of the Digital Capabilities Directorate, which is one of the newest groups. And so the really neat thing about that I appreciate is that they kind of took the strategy and matched it with people and budget, which is always important when you want to make a difference and you want to make progress. So if we could go ahead and advance the slide. So if you're not familiar with the Digital Capabilities Directorate specifically, really what we're trying to do is to introduce and to maintain and to support a kind of cohesive offering of technology and critical digital capacities for AFRL. And that actually includes really bringing the knowledge network and connectivity between our partners. So whether that's private sector, whether that are researchers, academics, really making sure that we are collectively more permeable to each other's information and insights. And really that includes not just digital transformation, but also, digital engineering is quite a popular term. And at the end of the day, this is all about maintaining adversarial advantage and dominance. Next slide. And so if you think about where the challenges are, none of these will surprise any of you, right? I really look at our customers as two parts. One is that researcher, scientist, academic doing the work, and the other is really the business of being in the work of invention, recombination, that is so critical for innovation. And as you look on this sheet, none of these, I'm sure, will surprise you. I'm sure many of them are maybe even frustrations that you have when you try to work with government. Next page. So what does that mean we really decided to focus on? In essence, we have a kind of four-stage format we call model, analyze, decide, and execute. And what we're really trying to understand is the ability to accelerate the use of adoption-ready technology and apply military benefit. So that breaks down into four main goal areas. And so what I'd ask you to think about, to the point of making this a two-way conversation, is there are the things where these four challenges are things that we have to do to be better as an enterprise. And there are things where in order to work with you, those also have to be better. So obviously the first critical goal is faster research, right? We want to be able to get that incredible insight or idea or thing that you might have in your brain, that vision, and get that into the proving grounds faster. The second is better decisions. So understanding, what are those things that we're doing, investing in that really are meeting kind of the threat parameters and the other things we see on the horizon, and what are things that maybe are not as relevant or where we need to be able to transition. The third, of course, is streamline transition. So how do we actually take those discoveries and get them into acquisition faster? And then most importantly, and this is probably not a really sexy one, but I call this last category toil. Meaning if you think about all of the time that you are spending not doing the research or the critical discovery or other things that you should be focusing on. So whether that is filling out an application, whether that is trying to access a data set, really our goal is to reduce that friction and reduce that toil. And this comes into, if you look on the left-hand side, this really comes into kind of 7 collaborative areas, right? So that is data, modeling and analysis, collaborative tools, infrastructure, cyber, of course, human capital, and architecture. And I'm just going over this really quickly. And if you see kind of where they line up, you can look at any of those kind of 12 areas about how we plan to really dig into those. The last thing I draw your attention to on the right is really this idea of foundational digital capacities. And so I highlight this because I think not only, is AFRL trying to understand, but I imagine all of your organizations are trying to understand and navigate some of these critical digital technologies and the role that they might play in advancing your work, your organization. So, data lifecycle management, the right information at the right time to the right person is really critical, right? That's paramount. The second, though, is again, worldwide research collaboration. At AFRL, we know that our job is not always to be the smartest, brilliant, genius person, but to make sure we are collecting and tapping into that genius. And so that concept of collaboration is really, really core to our heart. Also, federated connectivity and access. So again, how do we make it as easy as possible to move that information or move that knowledge to the right place at the right time? Hybrid multi-cloud. So again, making sure that whether our information or that knowledge is in our brains, is on-prem, is in a cloud environment, that it is in the right place, the right security parameter for us to do our work. Capability-based planning and management. This is a really, really key one I'm finding for leaders at all organizations, because what we're wanting to do is to move from, a reactive position, kind of getting information and then making a decision, to a proactive position, right? Really being able to forecast, to predict. And of course, with AI coming online, this is something that is really, really becoming even more critical. And again, please put questions or comments in the chat. I love to interact. Digital operations. So quite frankly, if we're going to be in the business of being a digital organization, what does that look like as far as how our backbones have to change, and even our budgeting, right? One of the things that I was talking about briefly yesterday is, there's a real challenge in understanding and being a digital organization. What does that mean as far as planning a budget, right? How do you factor in compute in a knowledge age, in ways that maybe we didn't have to do before? And then finally, really critical to powering all of this at the speed it needs to be is the high performance computing. And I think here, whether it's high performance compute, supercomputer, quantum, and the edge of things that we're on that, when we talk about things like digital twins, when we talk about this kind of capability, proactivity, we really have to have the robust, ability to process that information. And this is where I really am hopeful to be able to see Dayton emerge and have the potential to really be, not just Dayton, but all of Ohio, to be in the forefront of what might be kind of the supercomputing frontier. And of course, that's about investment and other types of things, but lots of high hopes in that area. Next slide. And, again, when we look at what that means as far as practicalities, you can kind of see, in data, one of the things we've got to do, right, is structure and secure our data. And I'm showing you all of this because, some of you may have tools around this that you think are really applicable to us. Some of you may have things that you think, gosh, you don't need to develop something. We use this and that's really effective, and would love to kind of know more about those. But here's a little bit of how those things break down. And again, going very quickly, I'm sure we can share this afterward. Okay, next. All right, so getting into questions, as was shared, and we can take the slide off if we want to stop presenting, Emma, so I can see people's faces, hopefully. So that's a little bit of kind of the quick and dirty of, where we are, what we're doing. But one of the things I'd really love to, to ask the folks here is, what is it that you are seeing in your own space right now? And I'm going to share with you a couple of insights that I'm noticing, and would love to know, again, some reactions and some of the questions that that brings up for me. So the first is, I think this is a really interesting time to walk into this role. And in essence, in an age where the technology and the accessibility and the ease of some of these technologies are really hitting an interesting new pinnacle. And what I mean by that is things like, cloud, APIs, the ability to connect information more fluidly and easily, and of course, AI. There's, edge computing and many other things. But I think these are important to highlight because what I'm seeing and what I saw when I was at Google for the last 3 years during this very interesting digital time is the ability to have those technologies is also changing a bit of how we are expecting leaders to lead. And what I mean by that is, as an example, and part of my research, when you look at things like government, defense, and other types of industries, the average change horizon prior to really the last 3 years was about 5 to 15 years, right? So if you think about it, we kind of have about 5 to 15 years to, whether that was a policy, a technology, a platform, we kind of have this, this ability to kind of, explore, ride, decide. And then at some point, those things become legacy, right? And become taken over. And that was very normal. That was how we're structured. And it was how we behaved as people and leaders. I'm sure many of you feel like that time horizon has shrunk just a bit. We can blame COVID, but I also think some of these technologies are also really coming into play at the same time. And what that means is, in my research, that change horizon shifted from 5 to 15 years to 6 months to 1.2 years, right? So if you think about what we've got to deliver faster than ever, that's actually pretty crazy. And when I think about that, as an individual leader, what that really means is that I might be expected to make 5 or more times the amount of decisions than I was in the previous time cycle before, right? So again, sometimes I find it's really helpful to think, all right, I know things are moving faster, but what does this mean? And what does it change in my relationship with knowledge, the pursuit of knowledge, innovation, et cetera? So that's factor number one. Factor number two is, at that same time that we had this change horizon shrink, we also had an explosion of available information, right? So many of you probably know that about 90% of the world's data, in essence, kind of came into accessible use in the last 3 years. 90%, right, in 3 years. So again, if you think about that as a leader, what that means is I'm having to navigate change faster, and I'm expected to use a lot more information than I ever was before to do that, right? So if any of us are feeling stressed, or if our leaders kind of sometimes feel like we don't know what exactly right is, it's because it's really hard, right? It's actually fundamentally different time. And so I say that really transparently, not because I have all of the answers, but because I think that if we accept those things, it becomes a really interesting question. Well, how do we lead differently, right? What are our values? How do we collaborate differently in light of those things and make ourselves more permeable? So I think that I kind of call it, and this is just Alexis's term, but I kind of look at it like we're entering this exponential age, right? So things are going to be exponentially moving. What does that mean for us? So that's kind of question number one for me. The other thing that I've really been watching, and I think, again, in this moment to come on as a new CIO is a, kind of a lots of planets aligning, if you will. And that is, really our relationship between structured and unstructured information, right? Because really, over most of the history of government and in defense, we have actively pursued and valued the information we can structure, right? Because there's control in that. We're cleaning data, we're perfecting it, we're organizing it, we're kind of becoming the masters of it, right? And that made a ton of sense when we want to be able to, especially in areas like finance, right, or HR, or procurement, or or research data, when you're looking at something very specific. And so I highlight that, though, because our relationship with information, from a human standpoint, in regards to technology has been very much one of control in the past, kind of 50 years. What has changed is now this ability with generative AI or other things to have a more curiosity-based relationship with information, where you're looking at information catalytically. And so an example of that I think is really interesting is if you look at the information that we really work to structure and organize and control in government and in DoD generally, that usually amounts to 20% or less of our information. When you look at the information we invest in, meaning the research that you do, right, the operations that we run, all of those types of things, where we really, really are actually actively investing in knowledge, the outcome of that is almost always unstructured, right? It's a white paper, it's a PDF, it's something else. Sometimes there's data sets, but if you think about that, 80% of the richness of our investment in our knowledge is actually really hard to access. And again, in part of my research recently, this will be something that I'm hoping to be proven wrong, but my current findings are that most information that is created by any organization, but by government generally is never read by more than 3 people, right? And it's not because it's not amazing and it's not important, it's because it's hard. It's because reading an 80-page white paper, right, or whatever I just don't have the time for that. Again, exponential age, closing, having to do things faster, having more information. So I say this because as the CIO and looking at our strategy and finding myself in this horizon tipping point between unstructured information and structured information, I'm struck by not only the technological decisions that it's asking, I think, me to reflect on, I'm also struck by the culture, right? And the values decisions that means. So, one of the things that I've shared with my team is that whenever, my tenure in this role is done, if I can simply have made it more easy and more enjoyable to be curious, right, to seek out information, to be able to be information rich, then I will have been successful. Because I really believe that when we look at, and I'll give you this last little point, and then I'd love to open it up for comments, questions, and then leave you all with one other question. But if we use the example of an adversarial context around AI, a lot of what I'm seeing right now, for example, in the conversation is we really want to make sure we out AI the other guys, right? That we really, really are dominant there. And that's important. And I actually have a lot of belief that we'll continue to do that pretty well. What we aren't necessarily paying as much attention to are what I kind of call the bookends of that battle. And the first bookend is actually information, right? Because if you're thinking about feeding, feeding that AI, using that as an advantage, it matters what you nourish it with, right? And if the adversary can start with all the information, then they actually have a really great Thanksgiving dinner table, right? Of huge amount of nourishment. For us, if we silo or kingdom our relationship with that information, and let's say I've given, Anita, I think about it like a chessboard. If I've given Anita the pawn and Amy the queen and Anthony the king, and I have to go and find all these things, well, I'm really kind of doing an single meal MRE style, right, of information flow. And so, the first question for me, though, is that that's not actually a technology issue. It's a culture issue, right? And so, again, collectively, we have to think about how do we set that Thanksgiving dinner table across us for information flow. If we do that, then what we're feeding our technology with is going to be even more rich. The final bookend, though, to that point I was making on curiosity, is that once you have the information, once you have the tools, it actually then matters what questions you ask, right? It matters the form your curiosity takes. And this is where I think as researchers, as scientific community, as academia, as private sector, you often are in that curious state, right? Whether that's for competition reasons, whether that is just the nature of what draws you to being who you are. That is not always the case in government, right? Or in DoD. Like, I know that I felt previously, when I was a federal leader, that I had the curiosity beaten out of me, right? Because of things like the toil and having to set, things up, and just the amount of time things would take. So again, if we think about in an adversarial context, if I've got all that information that we've all shared, and if I have these great tools that maybe you're helping create, then we've got to ask the best questions, right? We've got to be the most curious. And so that's why, kind of bringing it full circle, when we look at digital transformation, there's really this question of how do we both solve the technical opportunity, right? The collaborative opportunity, and more importantly, even the cultural opportunity. And I don't have all the answers, but I hope this, at least I didn't put you to sleep with the types of things I'm sharing that I'm wrestling with. And the last thing I'll give you, and hopefully you'll tell me and give me some insights, is I actually am really interested right now. One of the things I'm looking at, for example, is budgeting. And I would love to hear from you all, or even kind of work with this group on how much of a given project are you actually starting to budget from like a compute data technology lens, right? How is that different than it might have been, 3 years ago, 5 years ago? Are we planning differently for that? Because I think that this is something that everyone is really trying to get a handle on, and would love if people have a rule of thumb, that they can share either, here or with me later. I'm really trying to do a little bit of research in that case and understand what some of the standards are as we look to navigate some of these new technologies and new relationships with information. So I will stop there, Mark, but please, feel free. I'm seeing some really great notes by Amy, but feel free just to jump in and question. Okay. Mark, should I just go to Jose's
Yeah,
question?
You go right ahead. If somebody would like to come up, looks like actually Amy already has, but if you want to come off, Mike, just throw your hand up or something so we can recognize you too. But Amy, if you want to ask a quick question, and then we'll go to the chat.
Well, I had the fun opportunity of getting a tour at in Boulder, Colorado at Google recently. So
Yeah.
talking with Andrew Halpern, I don't know if you're,
yeah.
So in talking about Drive and what, so the strategic effort of making sure that information is primed, right? As people use it. And right now, a lot of it is based on, how recent somebody accessed something. Mm-hmm. But what's interesting is that what I found is that if you look at language itself, it's this really nested layer. Like the noun structure is about 50% of a paragraph. The verb structure is 25%. And then there's really pivotal moments, adjectives do a lot of adverbs do a lot of heavy lifting, which I'm really surprised about. And there's this idea that things happen at that language is wonderful because things are happening at different scales, is that there's this and sometimes when we're looking at recent things, is that we're looking at things at a very fast scale, but there's this whole other structure that it's built on. And I feel like sometimes we don't. I love the Air Force's approach to layered sensing, and think that that's something that, a layered learning approach is something that, we need to talk more of within this particular type of context, is that there's some concepts that really need a lot of refreshing. And then there's some concepts that are broader and are questions. What's interesting is that questions tend to be more general than our statements. Does that make sense? So the verbs kind of rule the questions, and our affirmations are ruled by our adjectives, our adverbs, and our nouns. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think, you raise a couple of really good points. And I think this is, again, the interesting, the wonderful blessing to not have to know it all and to be able to ask questions and say, wow, like what does this mean? A few kind of notes, because I think, you raised a couple of things for me. I think on one hand, what I'm finding, even with this language and things like that, is a lot of our relationship with knowledge is very tied up in our identity, right? And our perception of ourself and our perception of our purpose and value in others. And what has been really interesting is I've been working with leaders previously on area like AI, is we all assume we're really, really curious, but we don't understand how much the curiosity gets contained and honed based on that identity. And I'll give you an example. I worked on a project that was a hurricane response project, and it was for a particular state. And if you can imagine, a state often already knows at least a large percentage of who's financially vulnerable in their state based on housing, food, other types of assistance categories. And if you think about it, a state also, or a local entity also actually usually knows who's physically vulnerable, in the sense of if your house, if you're in a mobile home, or if you're in a stick built versus concrete, et cetera. We also have information, around the topography of an area. Is it going to be low lying and hold water, et cetera? But, Amy, what I think is really interesting for me about what you said is that, generally speaking, the person who does the food benefits doesn't see any value to talking to the person who does permitting and zoning, right? It has nothing to do with me, right? My identity is here. This is here. And yet in the hurricane, if you took the knowledge flow, right? If you took this and you imagine a big operations room, right, with lots of dots on the screen, and you said, okay, who's financially vulnerable, right? And dots light up. If you then overlay who's physically vulnerable, right? Take that zoning and permitting and other information, you see the dots get really, brighter in some categories. You then take the topographic information, it gets brighter. And then finally, when you take the path of the hurricane, you have these beacons of people that, wow, these people are really the most in danger, right? On many different levels, like you said. And what was interesting about that is because, the state knew who those people were, we were actually able to text message them $700 the day after the hurricane directly, right? And what was ironic, of course, is we could have sent that to them before the hurricane because of modeling, right? And actually help them escape. But I say all of this because it's been interesting for me when I talk about curiosity. It is not easy to be curious beyond our identities, right? It is not easy to always see the informational value, right, in things that are unrelated to us. And so I think that this question of how our relationship with unstructured data might allow us to build a language muscles and to build curiosity muscles is something that, is really, really interesting. I think to build on that, to Jose, to your question, I've been advising before taking this role with a couple of school districts, for example, on AI in particular. And I don't mean to be stuck on AI, but it's a nice illustrative. And I'm really discouraging school districts from, blocking ChatGPT and other types of things, because what we're seeing is that actually access to a lot of those tools and the use of them is actually giving novice or new learners much faster on ramps, right? Versus like the expertise delay that we would look at. And, so I think the other thing that as a leader that I look at, for example, at AI and what I think we want students to be able to do, we want them to be able to ask good questions, right? We want them to be able to be curious. We want them to be hungry for that information. And if you think about it, most information and most of our roles are about information curation, not creation, right? And I think the more we can help students understand it is your job to want information, to desire to bring it, and to organize it within a construct, then the better. And so, again, it's I think the more that we can encourage our students and our teams to play with this technology. As an aside, you've probably all seen ChatGPT, but Teachable Machine is another great free open tool that that kids are using. But I think those are the types of things of encouraging people to lean in and to use it to advantage versus being afraid of it is a really critical, element.
If you want to,
sorry, go ahead.
I'm going to say, I was just going to say, Alexis, so if you want to, because I know you have a flight to get to as well, but so actually Rick Graves, who's one of our subject matter experts for Ohio Federal Research Network, is asking a question since he's an internal person from AFRL, is kind of wondering, obviously from you, about potentially what your approach would be for AFR to managing and curating the data, he says, for the value change between categories.
Yeah, so I think again, it's all about right information at the right time. And right now that can be really hard. So if we think about that operational information, so he mentions finance data, acquisition data, research data. Um, I think part of what we want to be able to do is to reduce the toil on that. So what I mean by that is, right now, if you're a researcher, you might spend quite a lot of time spinning up an environment, getting access to data, trying to extract it, doing all those types of things. And so I'm really interested in figuring out, not only for AFRL writ large, but how do we create some environments, some ecosystems where that creating, the spinning up, et cetera, and collecting and sharing of data is actually faster, is kind of pre-planned. Also, a lot around what I would call sandboxing or rad labs. So those are unique environments that already deal with kind of security, privacy, other types of things. So again, those kind of come to play faster. I think that one of my big ambitions, of course, for DoD is really to be able to navigate multi-domain security issues, right? Taking information up, taking information down, because if our curiosity is going to be blocked at every security level, or our toil is going to be expanded, then that is really hard, right? And these aren't necessarily easy challenges, but certainly things. And I think one question is, and I'll end on this because I know we have another amazing speaker, but hopefully we'll get to have more conversation and quality engagements. I think one of the things that's really interesting for us to sit back and ask ourselves at this time is, what is it that we want to know, right? And what are the questions that we have? And so the way that I plan on doing that at AFRL and contributing is not only starting with what is it that we do, but what is our knowledge? So I call it knowledge mapping, meaning if you look at something like finance, the question will be, well, let's go ahead and map what information we have from where, right? What team puts that in? What teams depend on that? And then a little bit like the hurricane example, if we imagined bringing in this information, right, or this information, or collecting those capillary structures, what does that allow us to do? What new questions does that allow us to ask, right? What does that allow us to make decisions faster? So it's not a perfectly concise answer, but I think that question is really, is really just how are we more conscious knowledge players versus maybe being previously thinking about them as like system owners or platforms. Like I want to stop thinking about the system and the particular tech or the vendor or whatever, and I want to start thinking about our collective relationship with knowledge and information.
Okay, maybe so last question is from Kogan there in the chat. I'll let you, it's I think both a sort of a combination comment and question, but it does touch on some interesting areas about standards as far as the future goes. So maybe just providing some thoughts on his comments.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think knowledge graphs, this relationship with contextual information, right? Natural language processing, LLMs are going to be hugely important. This is also part of why, again, this is my background and bias, so we'll see kind of what plays out within the role of my new work. But I also am really a big believer in like data containerization. So how is it that we actually make information in its most its kind of most permeable, movable state versus to the point of metadata, versus kind of again what has tended to be a platform specific data set or kind of more controlled relationship with information. So of course there's hitting all the security standards and things that we need on that, but again, my goal is literally to make it easier to be more curious, right? And to have the joy of knowledge be unleashed more.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Alexis. Really appreciate your time this morning. And hopefully we will be able to have you come back at some point in the future and be able to give us some update on how things are going, since I know you've only been there like 2 months, right? So
yeah, I think actually like 29 business days or something like that, but it was so nice. So thank you for having me. I'm going to we spent a couple minutes looking at the chat. But again, hopefully I'll get to see y'all again and hopefully meet in person as well.